Daphne's presentation.
Thank you. It was my intention to look at revised chronologies that SIS have published and see where they overlap or where they conflict. But few revisionist chronologies have been fully published, so it's only by chance that I've learnt from a footnote or an email from the discussion group that, for example, Acheson's chronology takes account of changes in the length of the year, or that Sweeney's chronology ignores biblical dating. I shall therefore not be discussing chronologies, but the techniques that are used to construct them. I shall be considering mainly biblical and New Kingdom Egyptian material, and although I don't mention 99% of the people who've been working on chronologies, it's not because I'm ignoring them, it's just that I just couldn't cope with the volume of information I was taking in. So I shall look briefly at how Orthodox dating was calculated and outline Velikovsky's chronology, highlighting the problems revisionists have with it. I shall then discuss how facts are interpreted, the blending or dovetailing of facts, and the reliability of source material. I shall focus on the Amarna period to see where revisionists place their chronologies and their use of average generations, biblical 40-year generations, absolute dates, and co-regencies to locate when they are. I shall also look at alter egos as a technique with their associated alter places. As the traditional appendix, I shall mention Sothic dating and Nile flood dating. Orthodox Egyptologists use biblical dating to identify Shoshenq as Shishak, who attacked Jerusalem in year 5 of Rehoboam, and to date Taharka's overthrow to 664 BC. Sothic dating was used to begin the 12th dynasty about 1994 BC, and the 18th dynasty about 1575 BC. Ramses II's year 52 was dated to 1228 BC by a lunar date. In Peoples of the Sea, Velikovsky pointed out that Ramses III's accession was dated to 1147 BC, before Champollion had even translated Egyptian hieroglyphics, presumably by adding the regnal years supplied by Manetho. Orthodox Egyptologists had a long time frame, and dozens of kings' names were provided by late sources with no regnal years, so they could be distributed neatly within Manetho's framework, a source ancient enough to have been validated with the patina of truth. Biblical dates are only locked in at the lower end by the recorded actions of known Egyptian, Babylonian, and Persian kings, and the period before biblical kings, or even the earliest kings, could be dismissed as mythical or exaggerated. Velikovsky constructed his chronology within the framework of worldwide catastrophes datable from the Bible. The Exodus was dated to the mid-15th century, 480 years before Solomon laid the foundations for the temple, followed 52 years later by the defense of Gibeon, when the sun and moon stood still and stones fell from heaven and killed the fleeing Amorites. At the lower end, his chronology was locked to 747 BC, the beginning of the era of Nabonassar, when Velikovsky believed that 5 days were added to calendars. It was the period when Isaiah, Amos, Job, Hosea, and Micah prophesied catastrophes after the earthquake near the end of Azariah's reign. On the day Ahaz was buried in 715 BC, the day length changed, and in year 14 of Hezekiah it changed back again. The final disaster occurred in Hezekiah's year 29, 687 BC, when Sennacherib's army was defeated. Velikovsky identified Egyptian Hyksos with the biblical Amalekites encountered during Exodus. He could then align the start of Egypt's 18th dynasty with the first Hebrew kings, when the Hyksos Amalekites were expelled from Egypt and Israel by Carmos, Amos, Saul, and David. Numerous links between the two kingdoms then fell into place. Revisionists all support Velikovsky's contention that Egyptian dating is flawed and that the Dark Ages in the countries with connections to Egypt were artificially created because Egyptian history is overstretched. But there are problems with Velikovsky's chronology. It lengthens the period that Orthodox historians allocate to the Egyptian Second Intermediate period and the Hebrew period of Judges. but compresses the period allocated to the Egyptian dynasties following the 18th. Most chronologists reject his solution of deleting Dynasty 19 as an alter ego of Dynasty 26. In trying to correct what they see as Velikovsky's errors, some revisionists, for example James, Roll and Newgrosh, realign the 18th dynasty to an earlier time to make more room for later dynasties, while other revisionists compress still further the later dynasties of the Third Intermediate period. Most revisionists do not believe that the catastrophes Velikovsky described caused the year to lengthen by 5 days. The 12th dynasty roster of Phyle priests found at Lahun shows their shifts followed a lunar month, but it is dated on a 365-day civil calendar with the epigomenal days following 4 Shomu, month 12, where it's highlighted in orange. Lynn Rose is amongst those who do follow Velikovsky. He therefore places the 12th dynasty after what he calls the Velikovsky divide of 687 BC. Rose explains numerous examples that refute the possibility of the 12th dynasty coming after the 18th dynasty on an ad hoc basis. I don't know how Rose would explain the Rhind mathematical papyrus. It was copied in year 33 of the 15th dynasty Hyksos king Alsare Apophis. He was the enemy of the last kings of the 17th dynasty and of King Ahmose, the first 18th dynasty king. The scribe recorded that he was copying a document written in the reign of Nemat-Re, the 12th dynasty king Amenhotep III. This document seems to link the 12th, 15th, 17th, and 18th dynasties in their Orthodox order. Velikovsky thought the 18th dynasty papyrus Ebers was a 360-day civil calendar, which was evidence for a shorter year at that period. In 2010, I suggested that it was actually a lunar calendar, so does not provide any information about the length of the year, although my intention was only to disprove the supposed Sothic date within it. When discussing methodology, Roll noted that the raw materials of historical research are not simply the available archaeological and textual evidence, but the interpretations which scholars impose upon that evidence. The criterion of acceptance of any historical writing is whether it combines interpretations of evidence into a narrative consistent with our perceptions of the past. It is precisely the historian's desire to put their own interpretation on the evidence that makes it so difficult to unravel again. Writers mold identical coils seamlessly into pots of many shapes and sizes, and it is necessary to read their source material in order to separate the facts from their conjecture. An example of this is the way that Sweeney and Danelius discuss whether Thutmose III's first battle was at Jerusalem and not Megiddo. Sweeney mentions the capture of Joppa, which was the port for Jerusalem. But the annals of Thutmose III's first campaign mention Gaza, not Joppa. The romantic story of Joppa comes from the 19th dynasty papyrus Harris 500, so it is only an assumption that the tale is based on an event that occurred during the first campaign. Sweeney then adopts Danelius's suggestion that Thutmose's attack was against Jerusalem. The quoted text is in blue, and I've added the surrounding text it's drawn from. Danelius blends together Josephus's opinion of Rehoboam's state of mind 1,000 years earlier with snippets from Karnak and snippets from 2 Chronicles into a seamless account, blending complementary strands rather than juxtaposing mirror details, and adding her own assumption that the besieged kings opened the gates, whereas my understanding of the text is that they had to send to their own kingdoms for their ransoms. Roll uses a similar technique in A Test of Time when discussing Abdiheba in the Amarna letters and his enemy, the leader of the Hebiru, whom he identified as King David. He used the actions of one to explain the actions of the other. Remembering that David is the hireling of Achish, king of Gath, Abdi-Heber's letters appear to be referring to David's move to Hebron from his original base in Ziklag, which had previously been assigned to him by Achish. Small wonder that the king of Jerusalem was becoming nervous. The Habiru were moving into settlements immediately adjacent to his own territorial boundaries. Blending is used by both conventional and revisionist historians to achieve a believable narrative, but dovetailing cannot be used to prove its correctness. Only mirror details can do that. When sorting facts into a history, historians have depended on the Bible with its links to Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia. Velikovsky also drew on Ginsberg's legends, the Talmud and Midrash. Manetho, Africanus, Eusebius, Josephus, and Herodotus were among those who provided the skeleton on which the history of Egypt was built. There is a tendency among historians to imply that an older source is more reliable than a newer one, with the exception of Herodotus, who is considered a little gullible. 17th century historians are called on to back a theory or a thought if they had it first, and 19th and 20th century books and journals, archaeologists and historians all strengthen validation. The object remains, however, a tablet, a fragment of text, or a graffito, and no matter who discussed its meaning first, they probably did not have any more information available to them than we do now, and arrived at their conclusion in the same way. For example, in the Quran, Surah 27, there is a version of the biblical story of Solomon and Sheba, embellished with magical details, but with an interesting perspective on a story ancient even then. Solomon is conversing with ants, and when a hoopoe bird reports to him that Saba is ruled by a woman who owns a magnificent throne and worships the sun rather than God, Solomon sends the hoopoe bird to the queen with a letter summoning her to make submission to him. Her advisors want to make war, but she recognizes that kings, when they enter a country, despoil it and make the noblest of its people its meanest. She therefore sends Solomon a present, but he dismisses her gifts and sends her ambassador back with exactly the threat she anticipated. Be sure we shall come to them with such hosts as they will never be able to meet. Knowing that the Queen of Saba would come in person in submission, Solomon had her throne magically transported ahead of her arrival. There is no suggestion in the Bible that the Queen of Sheba was under duress, and the fact that she arrived with valuable gifts and returned home with gifts for Solomon suggests the relationship between the two monarchs was one of equals, like the great kings in the Amarna letters, who demanded gifts from Pharaoh and documented their own gifts to him. But the Quran describes the submission of a vassal to a great king, a very different political interpretation, but probably one deduced from the same text we still use. The Amarna letters are a body of correspondence written to Amenhotep III, Akhenaton, and Tutankhamun of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Identifying who wrote them is a major coil in a revisionist's pot. The placement is often related to the perceived political situation in Canaan and Syria, which in turn depends on which Egyptian is identified as Shishak and whether he is in the past or the future. Certain assumptions may be made. For example, the letter writer whom we know by title might use his name in a letter. Names have a meaning, so the translated form may be used by the writer. Names are abbreviated, and hyperchoristic names are a particular favorite of Rolls. Since the name of the deity is omitted, there is scope to restore it. Convincing narratives have been constructed from this fruitful harvest. Velikovsky identified the correspondent Reb-Adi as Ahab. It was highly seductive to match the most prolific Amarna letter writer to the biblical king to whom the most chapters are devoted. The choice of Reb-Adi brought its problems, however, since it included identifying his cities Sumer and Gebel with Samaria and Jezreel, and all the accompanying difficulties concerning the arrival of ships in the highlands. A very satisfactory political canvas can be drawn in this period because the biblical record is so extensive. However, the Amarna letters are about conflict between Pharaoh's vassals as well as a threat from a common enemy, and the period identified by Velikovsky is the only one in the divided kingdom where the two countries were not at war and allied on numerous occasions against Syria and Assyria, but the letters are silent about this cooperation. Roll identifies the Amarna correspondent Labaya as Saul, so need not concern himself with the plight of Reb-Adi, the king of conventionally accepted Byblos and Samarra. Nor is the political landscape a problem, since the conquest of Thutmose I and III took place during the time of Judges, when the record is sparse. The conquest of Ramses II in the guise of Shishak has not yet occurred, so Roll has a blank canvas on which to sketch. Sweeney, who supports Velikovsky's identification of Thutmose III as Shishak, ignores conventional Egyptian reign lengths in order to identify Baasha as the letter writer Labaya. Since Sweeney's Amarna placement is earlier than Omri, who built Samaria, he too can ignore Reb-Adi, who is the king of Byblos and Samarra in his chronology. Sweeney's lower date in the 630s is achieved by downdating the return of the Jews from exile in Babylon. I looked at Jim Riley's chronology at Lawrence Dixon's request. The 4 volumes are available to read online. His Amarna period is in a political landscape unconquered by Thutmose III, who died as a child, and his annals at Karnak are really the achievement of Pianki. Riley's biblical Amarna protagonists are Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and Amenhotep III is Shishak. Since the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah were at war for much of their existence, synchronizing the Amarna letters with one of these numerous episodes makes a gripping story, but clearly cannot confirm its historical accuracy. The concept of alter egos varies from the claim that kings are known by different names when they conquer new countries or are referred to in the literature of other countries. For example, Pul is assumed to be Tiglath-Pileser III. More often, alter egos conflate 2 historical characters into one. Velikovsky believed the Queen of Sheba was Hatshepsut and Ramses II was Necho II. Merciless II was Nabopolassar and Hattusilus III was Nebuchadnezzar. Since these people do not always have matching historical records, place names are also assumed to be incorrectly identified. So Hatshepsut's expedition to Punt became the Queen of Sheba's expedition to Israel. Velikovsky identified the biblical Ben-Hadad and his successor Hazael as Amarna correspondent Abdiaserta and his successor Aziru. Roll identifies Aziru as the biblical Hadadezer of Zobah, who was defeated by David, 2 Samuel chapter 3. Shalmaneser III's annals mention Hadadezer, the predecessor of Hazael, confirming that Hadadezer is the name of the biblical Ben-Hadad, who was Ahab's adversary. Ben-Hadad is presumed to be a title. Son of Hadad, like the Egyptian son of Re, could belong to anyone. Roll argues that Aziru is the hyperchoristicon of Hadadezer. It is actually an unnamed divinity's helper, but Roll chose Hadad. It could just be Ezra, a name in its own right. On the grounds that Aziru and Hazael sound similar, many revisionists keep them as alter egos. There is conveniently only one Hazael in the Bible, but there are 3 Ben-Hadads, as well as Hadadezer of Zobah. And at that point, I should belatedly be apologizing for my pronunciation, because I've actually got no idea how most of these names are pronounced. Sweeney follows Roll in making the link between Aziru, Hadadezer, and Ben-Hadad. He identifies Aziru as Ben-Hadad, son of Tabrimon, who in regnal year 16, Asa paid to create a diversion against Baasha. This event was only 31 years after Shishak came up to Jerusalem. Since Baasha died in year 26 of Asa, after a 24-year reign, the Amarna period has to begin within year 2 and year 26 of Asa. It would appear to require considerable readjustment of the remaining 31-year reign of Shishak's alter ego, Thutmose III, plus 26-year reign of his son, Amenhotep II, an 8-year reign of his grandson, Thutmose IV, and over 20 years of Amenhotep III's reign to get to the Amarna period, which is in Akhenaton's reign, even allowing a nominal 6 years of Amenhotep III's correspondence for reference, 85 years in total compressed into 45 years, or 41, whichever it is. Average generations is another tool used by chronologists. In a test of time, Roll took 19 king lists from across the ancient world and averaged their average reign lengths to arrive at 16.75 years. He then discounted the result and used a 20-year average to conform to Kitchen, while believing that an 18-year average reign was probably more accurate. He applied this average to the genealogy of the royal architects in Wadi Hammamat. It's dated to year 26 of Darius I, and 20-year average generations placed Ramses II in 936 BC instead of the Orthodox 1270, so contemporary with King Rehoboam of Israel. Riley relied heavily on average generations to identify his alignments. He applied it to the genealogy of Memphite priests. The genealogy identifies each cleric as the son of the priest in the preceding generation, according to Riley. He allowed only 16 years for each priest to procreate an unbroken line of firstborn sons who all survived without the disappointment of girls. Each official began their service at age 35. He used this method to prove that Thutmose III could not have had a 54-year reign. Turning to a chronology where we do have a complete list and know the reign lengths, the British monarchy from 1066 to 2012 spans 42 generations. The average reign length is 22.5, but individual reigns vary between less than a year and 64 years, and at least 10 out of 42 are not by direct descent. 20 generations could average 22.7, 22.85, or 19.05. That was just taken randomly, while any 100-year average between 36 and 14.14. Applying Kitchen and Roll's average of 20 would lose 106 years from the chronology, while applying Riley's 16 years would lose 274 years. The chronology of 265 popes spans 1973 years with an average 7.45-year reigns, but randomly selected sections of 21 popes, based on the Memphite chronology, varied from 5 to 14-year average reigns. Applying the average of 7.45 to any subset of popes would fail to reflect the actual span of years. The method of using average generations has the appearance of a legitimate technique, but seems instead to be manipulating the evidence to fit a theory. At the risk of being accused of contradicting myself, I think 40-year generations in biblical chronologies are a special case. John Crow discussed the 40-year reigns of the first 3 biblical kings and suggested it was improbable that 3 successive reigns were exactly 40 years. The length of Saul's reign is not known, but Knut Stenring, who wrote The Enclosed Garden, discovered the Kabbalah numbers hidden in the Old Testament. His chronology has a 23-year reign for Saul, followed by 2 years for Ishbosheth, and then 40 years for David, and only 29 years for Solomon, plus an 11-year co-regency. Solomon laid the foundations of the temple 480 years after the Exodus. In 1 Chronicles 6, the second Azariah is identified as the priest in Solomon's temple, but Zadok, 4 priests earlier, was high priest at the end of David's life. If the earlier Azariah was Solomon's high priest, there are 12 generations of priests to the Exodus, so each represents a period of 40 years. I think these priestly generations serve to mark a known time period when the actual genealogy is not known. Thus Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus through Jeconiah, who was taken into captivity, back through the kings of David's line to Abraham. 1 Chronicles lists the descendants of Aaron down to the exile. I think it is precisely because the list measures a time span that they do not record every high priest, even though several others are mentioned in the Bible. The historical line of kings from Solomon to the exile is 374 years, using Thiele's Orthodox dating. The parallel line of 10 high priests span a similar period of 400 years, with a 40-year average generation. So the later part of Matthew's genealogy, I had only just realised actually that it's all scrambled, but anyway, I hope you can still follow it. The later part of Matthew's genealogy, belonging in the more recent period after the exile, is probably also symbolic. This symmetry of the ancestors of Jesus framing a specific time period is noted in Matthew 1:17. There are 14 ancestors from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the deportation to Babylon, and 14 from the deportation to the Messiah. Jeconiah is named twice. The measure includes Jesus, but 13 generations probably also stand for a historical time span. 520 years is 90 years less than the time allocated conventionally between Josiah's death in 609 and the birth of Christ. But there would be no justification for revisionists to convert Matthew's symbolic generations to, say, a 20-year average generation, or to remove the time span altogether. Absolute dates in Orthodox chronologies have been built on Ptolemy's canon, Assyrian limu lists, and biblical synchronisms, working back from Alexander's conquest of Egypt or the fall of Jerusalem in 586. Biblical dating is itself a challenge because the synchronisms between Judah and Israel are internally inconsistent. In an article in 1994, I explained how ghost co-regencies were created when redactors of the Bible aligned events to significant dates. The penultimate event dated by this system is the Day of Atonement, celebrated by the exiles who returned to Jerusalem in the first year of Cyrus. The event is recorded in Ezra 3:6 on Lunar Day 10/7 3403, which is 1,204,494 days from the beginning. 5 days later, the Feast of Tabernacles would begin. This is the 300th event, and on the solar calendar it falls on the last day of the 3,300th year since the beginning of creation. The redactors of the Bible pushed back the reign of Hezekiah to tie his feast to another hidden date. This caused earlier reigns to have apparent 11, 12, or 14-year co-regencies. There is more than one way to correct these alignments to synchronize them with historical events, as well as internally. And Thiele's arrangement of reigns is by no means the only possibility. The initial discrepancy between the Bible and Assyrian limu lists has been adjusted in many different ways. In the chronology I published in 1994, I removed 12 years from Peka's reign. In his 2009 article, Horrocks mentioned that Tetley believed the Assyrian limu lists were missing 22 eponyms from the reign of Shamshi Adad V and 21 from the reign of Adad-Neheri III. Aronson made a similar adjustment when he suggested Pul was a different person to Tiglath-Pileser III, with an independent reign. Orthodox chronologists followed Thiele, who shortened Peka's reign by creating a rival reign starting at the same time as Manasseh's. Aitchison shortened the reign of Azariah, and Alan Montgomery, whose inerrancy paper is available on the internet, introduced interregnums to keep dates aligned. Another problem with biblical data that was discussed by Tony Rees is that the ages of kings at their accession is connected to Kabbalah, but Rees does not suggest this also applied to reign lengths. My analysis revealed what I thought were the historical reign lengths preserved within a system of dating that was made flexible by locking reigns to the junior co-regent of the other country. This allowed the redactors to hide many significant dates within the chronology. An awareness of these problems is necessary for anyone wishing to use biblical chronology to support their dating. Co-regencies are as much a feature of Egyptian reign length adjustment as they are of Hebrew. Since non-mention of a co-regency cannot be taken as evidence it did not happen, they are used very conveniently to adjust revisionist chronologies. An interesting co-regency debate arises around Akhenaton's succession. The debate is among Orthodox historians because a docket on a letter of commiseration from Tushratta to Akhenaton after the death of Amenhotep III was dated year 2, or possibly year 12, or possibly just took a long time to arrive. Newgrosh has built the 12-year co-regency into his chronology, while Barry, I believe, gives Akhenaton a full 17-year reign. Other than considerations about whether a specific chronology of the Amarna period fits, it boils down to a subjective evaluation about whether the rebellious conditions in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria that featured in the Amarna letters lasted more than 25 years or less than 10 years, and whether the same pleas are repeated in 2 reigns or whether they are fired off to both kings at the same time. Coming back to alter egos, Sweeney also identified a number in the late period which reduced historical time before Alexander. He suggests it was Artaxerxes III, an alter ego of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and carried the Jews off into captivity in Babylon. It was Nabonidus II, an alter ego of Darius III, who 5 years after Artaxerxes' death was defeated by Alexander in 332 BC. It was only then that the Jews returned from exile, rather than in the first year of Cyrus, conventionally 538 BC. Cyrus is an alter ego of Tiglath-Pileser III, who conquered Nabonidus I, an alter ego of Nabonassar in the 6th century. Sweeney suggested that the existence of these 2 Naboniduses caused the Jews to muddle their chronicles, that they would have forgotten the circumstances of their return from exile less than 100 years after Alexander conquered Artaxerxes III is not credible. The redaction of the Bible we use today, including 2 Chronicles, the source of Sweeney's information about Nebuchadnezzar, contains those hidden Kabbalah dates revealed by Stenring. The Era Mundi chronology was constructed near the time of the Canopus decree, which is dated 17th Tibi, year 9 of Ptolemy III Euergetes in 238 BC. That Egyptian year began on the 1st of Thoth, 239 BC, 3,600 solar years to the day from day 1 of Era Mundi, when God made heaven and earth. Instead of demonstrating that alter egos went to the same place and did the same things, revisionists often follow Velikovsky in assuming that since they are the same person, the places they went to have been incorrectly identified. Orthodox historians only recognize Tel Nebi Mend as the location of Kadesh. In Velikovsky's reconstruction, since Ramses II's battle against Hatshepsut III was at Kadesh, while Necho II fought Nebuchadnezzar at Carchemish, Kadesh had to be Carchemish. Velikovsky's belief that they were alternative names for the same place in Ramses II's monuments and were never both listed together is not correct. They certainly appear to be different places where they are both listed on the same monument, as recorded in Breasted, Volume 3, Sections 306 and 309. Velikovsky's discussion about the name of the rivers is not convincing, but Breasted and Gardner's discussion of compass points, when south also means upriver, is coloured by their conviction of the locality. The Hittite spies claimed their army was hiding at Aleppo, which would have been a risk to an army at Carchemish and only reassuring to one at Kadesh. Velikovsky compared the topography of Tel Nebi Mend unfavourably with the plan of Kadesh on Ramses II's monuments. But from the Google images, the geographical features look very similar. Situated on the west bank of a major river with a smaller stream flowing along one side and entering the main river north of each Tel. The 1921 archaeological dig at Tel Nebi Mend that Velikovsky knew about had found nothing to contradict his view that Kadesh was not Tel Nebi Mend, but Carchemish. But a dig in 1975 uncovered 6 tablets in the late Bronze Age stratum at Tel Nebi Mend. One was from the king of Aleppo and addressed to Nikmadu. King Itagama of Kadesh was killed by a son called Nikmadu during a siege of Kadesh, according to Merciless's annals. Since Merciless's brother was viceroy of Carchemish, it's hard to escape the conclusion that Tel Nebi Mend has been correctly identified as Kadesh. Velikovsky argued that Carchemish Kadesh is not the Kadesh whose king was besieged by Thutmose III at Megiddo. That Kadesh was Jerusalem. There were many other holy cities named Kadesh in Israel. The most often named was Kadesh Barnea in the Negev. There was also a Kadesh in Naphtali, and yet another Kadesh in Issachar, right between Megiddo and Tanakh, mentioned in Joshua. In Ages in Chaos, Velikovsky did not discuss Thutmose III's 6th campaign, where he captured Kadesh while campaigning in the vicinity of Arvad and Samarra. But in Ramses II and his time, Velikovsky argued that this Kadesh was also Carchemish. I'd like to finish with some remarks about Sothic dating, on which conventional chronology depended. Parker suggested that the heliacal rising of Sothis was used to intercalate the lunar calendar to keep it in the seasons in which the festivals were held. Since both the heliacal rising of Sothis and lunar observations varied with latitude, different regions would intercalate lunar months in different years. The advantage of the civil calendar was that the date was the same over the entire empire, from Kush to the Euphrates. If a leap year was used prior to 238, there's no evidence for it. It only became useful to add a leap year to keep the civil calendar in season after seasonal festivals had been transferred to it. The Canopus decree described the usefulness of the heliacal rising of Sothis for that purpose, because in 238 BC it was expected on 1 Peni and could be kept there by adding a 6th epigomenal day every 4th year. If I understand the text correctly, it was on the day of the heliacal rising of Sothis that the annual 5-day festival began, and not on the first day of the calendar year. The heliacal rising of Sothis was an astronomical event that happened every year. There is no need to assume any connection with a calendar to be able to convert a heliacal rising expressed on the Egyptian civil calendar to a Julian or Gregorian date. It seems unlikely that the era of Nabonassar, which began in 747 BC, reached as far as Egypt. It would require the Egyptian calendar to have been reset to approximately 2 Peret 10, the middle of month 6. It seems more logical for a revisionist to assume that the civil calendar dropped out of use during the second intermediate period of numerous petty kings following a global catastrophe, and was not re-established until about 1291 BC. Only a calendar reset to the 1st of Thoth in about 1291 BC would bring it to 1 Peni in 238 BC. The Nile flood did not rise every year on the date of the heliacal rising of Sothis, as some revisionists assume. It was the consequence of the monsoon in Ethiopia, which is influenced by El Niño and jet streams. It is a variable event ranging from 200 to 400 days between peaks, so it could not have been used to regulate a calendar, as John Dayton suggested, any more than a snowfall marks the solstice. I did not know what I was going to learn when I offered to give this talk, or I might have called it, "What is Truth and Where's the Proof?" But I think I understand better why chronologies do vary so much. It was only gradually that Orthodox historians agreed on the identity of people and places, or the meaning of words. The analytical process revealed in the painstaking work of specialists in the field was no different to that undertaken by members of SIS. Because we're not professionals, we do not have to make do with an acceptable history, but we do have to be scrupulous that we do not let enthusiasm override common sense. We need to analyse the facts without overloading them with subjective interpretation. Personally, I'm not sure I can relinquish Ahab Rebadi, but I would like to learn Akkadian so that I can understand him better. Thank you very much. I was hoping that if you wanted to ask any questions, you could ask each other or some people more expert in the field than I am.